is my honor to introduce our authors today. Anne Hood is the author of the best-selling novels, The Book That Matters Most, The Red Thread, and The Knitting Circle. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Paris Review, O Magazine, and Real Simple. She's the recipient of a Best American Travel Writing Award, among many other honors, and she lives in Providence, Rhode Island. Julia Cooke is joining her. She is a journalist and travel writer whose features and personal essays have been published in Time, Smithsonian, and Condé Nast Traveler. She's the author of The Other Side of Paradise, Life in the New Cuba. The daughter of a former Pan Am executive, Cooke grew up in the Pan Am family, a still strong network across the globe, and she lives in Vermont. Welcome, Anne and Julia.
Thank you, Jen.
Hi to both. Thank you so much for having me. And I'm so excited to talk to you, Anne, about your new book, Fly Girl, which I've got right here, which was amazing.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
I remember when we talked about your book last year, and I think I was still writing Fly Girl, maybe, right?
Yeah.
I don't even know if I'd finished it yet.
I remember. Yeah. So I wrote a book for that. I realized that the bio that I sent to Jen did not include the actually pertinent piece of my bio that renders me qualified to talk to Anne about Fly Girl, which is that I wrote a book about airline stewardesses back when they were still called stewardesses in the 60s. And their role in international diplomacy in American history on some level. So Anne and I had an amazing conversation last May, I think, April, May.
Yeah.
And it felt like we could have just kept talking for hours. So I think I just have a whole bunch of questions for you, which I'm dying to know, and which I'm sure everyone in the audience will be really excited to hear about. So I'm just going to dive right in.
Great.
Yeah, so for anyone who has not read this book, which would be probably everyone, because it's not out yet, right?
It's just out. It's just out, I think, on Monday. Yeah.
Yeah, got it. Okay. Explain to everyone exactly what you loved about being a flight attendant. You started in '78. Yep. You were super excited for it. Why?
That's such a good question, because even when I took the job in '78, which was a time culturally, as you know, Julia, as everyone knows, where women still had like one foot in old-fashioned domesticity, and yet the other foot was fighting for equal pay, fighting for women's rights. And so it was a very complicated and confusing time. I just had stars in my eyes. I wanted to get out of my little town of West Warwick, Rhode Island, which was a depressed mill town. And I wanted to go to the places I saw in movies and read about in books, and being a flight attendant offered me that opportunity. So even though it was a time when flight attendants were still thought of as sex kittens or glorified waitresses, I understood that it was also a job of empowerment, because you traveled alone, you handled difficult situations, and you saw the world. And so that can't be bad, right? So I just wanted to get on that airplane and go.
Well, and you also saw the world on your terms to a huge extent. You know, you were given per diems. You talk about stopping by the front desk at these hotels and just picking up your envelope of cash, and that's company cash that you get to walk through this new city in the world in with.
Right. And we stayed in great hotels. We were very well taken care of, and actually very well respected by the company and the people around us, the people we interacted with. The hotel staff was always so happy to see that 747 crew walk into a hotel lobby and hand us that cash and tell us what to see and do. So yeah, it was pretty nice.
It's so interesting. So there were a couple of things that really struck me about your book. Number one, I really admired how really seamlessly you wove in such really important historical context, and like, you know, what was happening on like a socio-political level around what you were experiencing. And then you got right back to exactly what you were doing. I really admired how you went off on these tangents of history to contextualize your own experiences. But I'm so curious as a writer, how you wrote this book. Did you plumb letters to your parents? Did you keep a travel journal back then? What was it like for you?
I wish I had kept anything, because I really had just my memory. And I really bothered my old roommate. I went and stayed with her for 3 days and kept, asking her questions to confirm what I remembered. And she remembered some new things that kind of jogged my mind. I talked to two really good friends of mine who I flew with at TWA, and they're both male flight attendants. So I got their perspective as well. And then I really just started doing research. And I have to say, the first few drafts of the book were too research heavy. I don't know if you find that, Julia, as a journalist. It's like, I learned all this, therefore you must know I did all this work. And it sort of overpowered my story. And my editor was brilliant and keeps saying, more Anne, until I got the right balance. I had a great time, though, looking at old ads, like magazine ads and TV ads, and pulling up old TWA menus and uniforms. And it was a great rabbit hole to go down. And I kept a lot of notes, but when I sat down to write, ultimately, I depended on what I remembered, how I felt. That's what I really had to excavate. Who was that 21-year-old young woman, just fresh out of college, embarking on this exciting career?
Did anything surprise you about that experience of excavating that 21-year-old woman?
Oh my goodness, Julia. I mean, I still blushed at some of the things that I did or thought or tried. Or when I went to training, I believed that there were parachutes under the seats on the planes. In case something happened, we would all parachute out. Even though I had flown half a dozen times and on some pretty long flights, I guess I'm like everyone else. I never listened to the safety demonstration. So I had all misconceptions about what the job was, how airplanes worked, how service worked. But even as I flew in those early days, I still had like sort of a naive, small town sensibility. And so when we were told that we had to talk to 3 passengers per flight, I put my foot in my mouth so many times.
That part of your book, it shocked me. I was floored by the idea that, TWA would decide that, it's not like you're under enough pressure as is, having to present this totally seamless, glamorous, affect, and, stay totally attuned to everything in the cabin, run around serving everyone, take into account really, really serious issues of security and mechanical trouble, possibly.
Yes,
and at the same time, you have to come up with meaningful conversation to have with these passengers. It's incredible.
That was the word that really tripped me up, meaningful. I was like, especially because when that directive came, I was flying a lot of very short flights. Mm-hmm. So I was on a plane, like 5 legs, each segment was under 2 hours. So, and we used to serve full meals on those were the days, people complained about airplane food, but when it was taken away, we complained louder. Yeah. So it would be cocktail service, full meal, getting everybody strapped in, all of the stuff you have to do, and 3 meaningful conversations, right?
Well, and who's to say what's meaningful for one person and not meaningful for someone else?
That's funny, because what I realized after flying for several years was to most people, it's meaningful for the flight attendant to just look you in the eye and say, may I take that for you? Or are you on your way home? Or it doesn't have to be a real meaningful conversation to feel like the person's being, nice to you and generous and giving you their time.
There's an amazing moment in your book where you talk about how life happens on planes. And how people are going to and from, and it's such an astute observation, right? That people are going to and from weddings and funerals. And for my book, I talked to a lot of people who were refugees, or who were, flying to new homes from behind the Iron Curtain into the US, or who were evacuating from Vietnam. These are the most important moments of people's lives, whether you're flying from New York to Ohio or from Saigon to LA, these are the absolute most important moments of people's lives, and you are a part of it.
Yes, absolutely. I can remember a flight with refugees taking up most of the main cabin on a 747. I can remember many flights of people going to adopt children and having those babies with them, never knowing that I would find myself I would be that passenger in 2005 coming back from China with my daughter. But I had first seen that and even learned about it, on airplanes. Even on a lighter note, when we would fly to Las Vegas on the way over, it was like a party plane. People couldn't wait to get to Las Vegas. They were so excited. We used to even play games with them sometimes. A creative flight attendant would say, whoever's closest birthday is closest today gets a free cocktail or whatever. And on the way back, it was somber.
Yeah.
And so just they had all lost money or not what as they hoped. And those flights would be very quiet. So just observing how to a flight attendant who's doing this day in and day out, it becomes routine. But for the passenger, it's often anything but.
Totally. So I guess one of my questions for you was going to be, if in that moment, as you were participating in these moments in people's lives, and as you were, participating in this incredibly important moment of women's history,
yes,
were you aware that what you were doing was important while you were doing it? Or did that realization dawn later on?
I didn't realize it at all. I really
did the women that I interviewed for my book. It's incredible.
It's incredible. I had no idea. And in fact, while I was a flight attendant, the women who had to quit because they had children won their jobs back. And they'd been fighting for them for years for that job back. And they came back from where I sit now, rightfully so. They came back and they maintained their seniority. So if they had been hired in 1972 or 64 or whatever, they came back with that seniority. So all of us got bumped way back in seniority. I was angry. I'm like, who do they think they are? I wasn't even thinking about this historic thing they had accomplished, that they had won.
I mean, if I were 22, I would have thought the exact same thing.
Yeah, it's like, wait a minute, I'm back on reserve because these mothers came back. And I feel terrible when I say that. But that one, it didn't take me years to figure out. I mean, other flight attendants were sort of like, hey, slow down, young girl, this is why, and this is what happened. And they gave me some perspective. But, you're moving through your life, falling in and out of love, trying to balance your job with a social life, trying to be in the world. And things are happening around you that you're a part of that you don't even realize the impact that they're going to have. I
realize that maybe that some of the people on some of your fans of your writing may not be fully aware of just how historic the role that Anne played, that the job that Anne was doing actually was. And she lays it out in the book incredibly, but like it's, the job of stewardess and then flight attendant in the 60s, it began as being this incredibly, just profoundly sexist. You had to be under 26 at the time of hire and unmarried because the airline executives wanted you to be able to be an object of desire for the passengers. And you got to be fired if you were married, if you got married while you were on the job. You certainly could never be pregnant. You had to meet certain height, weight, appearance requirements. And there were rules around being women. And then over the course of the 70s, late 60s and early 70s, and then late 70s, each one of those rules was challenged in the courts by stewardesses who wanted to keep their jobs while they were married, and who wanted to be called flight attendants because they could be men too, and who wanted to be able to, get pregnant and then go back to work. All very basic legal rights of the workplace. And these rights were fought for one by one and won. And actually set the labor law precedent for much of what women of my generation then came to enjoy as workplace rights. So
and Julia, even age caps, you may remember
exactly,
that.
35.
Yeah, it was, some airlines had it as low as 28. And
really?
Then, some had it as low as 28. Most of the bigger ones, it was 32 and then crept up a little, throughout the 60s and 70s. But to think that even age and that young age.
It's amazing.
Yeah, one airline, and I can't remember which one, I think I know, but I don't want to, say it if I'm wrong, said if a man doesn't want them by the time they're 32, neither do we. And that was like in the 70s.
And it's incredible. So you have all of these amazing quotes in your book about the way that, so back up, another one of the things I really admired about the way you wove in the history and the personal is, you would quote an airline executive saying something incredibly sexist, and then quote a passenger saying something incredibly demeaning and sexist to you. And so we see the broader picture of it. And we also see the way that acts on a single person doing this job, which is incredibly important for you, but which, did you want to tell the audience about anything specific?
So many things, right? My mind is racing as you say that. I remember walking down the aisle, with probably trays in my hand or drinks in my hand. And a guy was reading a book I had just read. And I said, oh, I loved that book. And he looked up at me and with complete disbelief. He said, "You read?" And I have to say that the sexism, it bothered me less in some ways than when they questioned my intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
To think that only bimbos would want this
Mm-hmm.
job. That
Oh,
would really make me angry, because there were language requirements. Like for Pan Am, you had to speak the language. That's why I didn't get hired by Pan Am. My third interview, I failed my French test.
mm-hmm.
I was ready to go. I was as good as hired, and I had that one last test. TWA preferred college educated flight attendants when I was hired in 78 and for the next
Mm-hmm.
8 years or something. And so to assume that only certain kinds of people wanted the job.
Yeah, that you had to look a certain way if you were a reader.
Yeah, exactly. So things like that happened all the time. I will also say, though, that we had these mixed messages also from our training. So we were taught how to sort of perch on the first class armrest with our legs crossed. I would say beguiling, but we were in kind of military uniforms. I happened to be lucky enough to avoid when they hit one airline had flight attendants strip takeoff.
Oh yeah, that Braniff.
The airstrip. Yeah, Braniff.
The airstrip. It was
TWA
amazing.
was famous or infamous for paper uniforms for a short period of time because they ripped so much they had to get rid of them.
Yeah.
So at least I was in sort of a neutral, uniform, but we used to have to perch on the seat to take the first class drink orders. We had to learn how to walk down the spiral staircase in the 747 safely, so that we were doing it safely, but also to show off our legs. And so we were doing that while we were also fighting for rights and getting more pay, and the job was becoming more professionalized.
It's so interesting because another one of the things that struck me was reading about how, when you wrote about how some of your college friends saw your choice to become a flight attendant as doing something that was stuck in time. And you referred to this at the beginning of our chat.
Yes.
That, this job was seen as being really, by the late 70s, as being demeaning, and that your friends were kind of like, you're that's not you're obstructing women's progress. What are you doing? What's fascinating to me is that 15 years earlier, the women that I interviewed, who are just a little older than you are, their parents and friends had issues with them being a glorified waitress, which was the same thing that your friend said to you.
Yes.
But it was less about progress than about propriety, that they were more concerned about women's modesty, and that stewardesses back then were seen as being, vamps and easy.
Oh,
and
that's
this is
so
10 years of difference. It's fascinating to me how these stereotypes, it's like they just tack, but they don't go away, they're just taking on a different. So I was just, all of this is to say, I was super impressed by the poise that you seemed to be able to muster in that kind of a moment.
I have to say that there, I just felt, as I said earlier, but I really felt like I was about to have a great adventure that people going into their, entry-level banking or business jobs, I'm not demeaning that, it just wasn't for me, we're not going to have, I just knew that I liked the idea that I was entering a job in which anything could happen and I could go anywhere. And that was exciting to me. So they would say this, but I'd think, well, I know what I'm going to get from this, or I suspect I know what I'm going to get from this and what you're missing out on. And I think ultimately that came to pass. So
tell our watchers or viewers a little bit about some of those adventures. I'm sure that's what everyone wants to hear about, because it's amazing.
I have to say, I've done, already started doing interviews for the book, and almost one of the first questions is, did you date passengers? Everybody's really curious about what flight attendants are actually up to, I guess. I have this experience that two come to mind. They're both in the book, but one is I was flying on reserve. For those who don't know it, that means you don't have a regular route, a regular schedule. You're sort of at the beck and call of the crew schedulers who are watching all the staffing of the flights and realizing this flight's really full, so we need extra flight attendants on it, or somebody just called off sick on this flight, and you're waiting and they say, okay, get to the airport, you have an hour to get there and jump on this plane. The junior people are the ones on reserve. And so I often flew, when I was flying international out of JFK, with very senior crews. I mean, some of them remembered flying with Howard Hughes, and him coming on with, movie stars, and they had great stories if they deigned to tell us about, if they deigned to talk to us. Seniority is everything in airlines, and not everybody was gracious or generous with the younger, newer people. I went on a flight to Lisbon. I was so excited because I'd never been. The flight was horrific. Passengers were, maybe it had been delayed, I can't remember, but everybody seemed cranky, demanding. No one was ever going to fly TWA again. Everybody was mad. And we landed, and we were all so glad to be off that plane. And I remember thinking, I'll never have to see those passengers again. That's what's good about my job. 7 bad hours, but then they're gone. And I said, hey, what's everybody doing? And they all said they were doing nothing. And then I, mustered my 23-year-old energy or whatever, and said, I'm going to go into Lisbon. I've never been. I'm so excited. And so I went into the lobby. Number one, most of the passengers were staying at that hotel, so I did see them again. But then I saw all of the crew going out. And, I had that that high school feeling of no one sitting with me at the lunch table. But I took a deep breath and I went out, and I only got as far as a cafe before I got a little nervous. The city was intimidating. And I went in, and this, I have to say, it sounds like a romance novel, but this pretty cute guy came up and said, do you help? I was trying to figure out the money. It was before the euro. And we started talking, and he offered to take me around the city. He was a lifelong Lisboner. And I took that chance because that flight crew wasn't nice to me, and because I was willing to have an adventure and do something by myself. And that's part of that independence I was talking about.
Totally. Yeah, it really, it strikes me that, this actually ties in with a question that someone just put in the chat. Great. What was your perspective on the Coffee, Tea, or Me bestseller? And was there kind of a team spirit with the crew?
Oh, those are good questions. So the Coffee, Tea, or Me came out a good 10 years before I started flying, maybe more. And I had read it, and it was so titillating because I read it when I was like in junior high or something. And it was very titillating. And I think there was even a movie. It was just sort of on the periphery of my mind. I didn't really connect it with what I was doing. The job I was about to take, enough time had gone by. I did reread it for the book when I was writing. It was part of my research, and I was aghast. I was aghast at the illustrations of the busty stewardesses, the kinds of things they accept, and with a smile. Someone touches her belly button, and she's like, oh, that tickles. I was like, oh no, that would not have happened in 1978, right? So it was kind of a joke, even by the time I started flying the book and the idea of it. What was the second part of the question? Oh, the teamwork. Yes, you had to work as a team, but it didn't mean you all wanted to hang out together afterwards. But you're on the other side of that liquor cart with someone else, and you're running for ice when they need it, and they're giving you their extra ginger ales, and the person in the galley would be getting the food out to you. So it is really a well-organized, well-run machine. But when the service is done, you weren't always chummy. Sometimes you were, and sometimes not.
Totally. Side note about Coffee, Tea, or Me. I don't know if everyone on this chat talk knows that it was actually written by a man.
Yes.
A male PR executive, and it was a total fabrication, complete figment of his imagination. So
of fantasy.
Exactly. So we have a couple more questions, which are really good questions. One of them ties into this concept of stereotyping, which is, Coffee, Tea, or Me hugely participated in and helped create these stereotypes. How did your family react to your job choice?
So they loved the idea. When I first told them, it was the winter break of my senior year of college. And they were kind of like, so you majored in English. My mother always was like, so you'll be a teacher. And I was like, no. Well, what are you going to do? And I said, well, I was thinking about being a flight attendant. And my father jumped on that. My father had wanderlust and loved to travel. And I remember practically the first thing he said was, do we get free tickets?
That's
and
the
they
next
did.
question.
And they did. So he said, get in the car immediately on this cold December day, get in the car. We drove the hour to Logan Airport. He would wait in front when you could do that. And I went into every airline except the international ones and got flight attendant applications. Everybody was hiring at that time, from small airlines like Allegheny and Piedmont to all the big ones. So I had a stack. And then we drove home, and he sat me down. I'd never filled out an application for anything. So he told me how to do it. He instructed me. Some of them were very basic, name, age, height, weight. Everyone asked, do you know how to swim? which really puzzled me until I got to training and realized that in case of an ocean ditching, ocean or a water emergency, swimming could become important. So you had to swim to have the job, basically. So they kind of embraced it. And once I had that 6-month probation period end, and I got those free tickets for myself and my family, my parents used them all the time. So yeah, they liked it.
It's such an interesting, it shows a real remarkable like sense of adventure and also awareness and trust in you for your parents to be that gung-ho about it. And in that era, I think that's, truly, I think none of the women that I interviewed for my book, which there were many dozens of them,
Really?
almost all of them said that their parents were kind of aghast. And again, these are women who were older, a fair amount older than you.
Yeah,
so,
that's
this was 10, 15 years earlier.
Wow, that's so interesting. I mean, I had friends in training and beyond who several of their siblings were flight attendants. Like the family was like, you do that too. She's having a blast. You go do that.
No, and it was an incredible job. When you think about all the things that it offered, it was an absolutely amazing job. The stereotyping was just so pervasive that it really got into the heads of so many people. Yeah, I think. Okay. And last part of that question is, did they get to see you working and feel proud of you? You kind of answered that, but let's just put a little.
Oh yeah, I said they used the passes a lot, but they also would fly on flights I was working. Mm-hmm. And one day, this was so great. I was living in New York City. I had my little apartment on Bleecker Street in Greenwich Village. I was on reserve flying international out of JFK. And I knew for some reason, sometimes this happened, that I would get a flight on the next day. They were like, we don't need you today, but we'll definitely use you tomorrow. But I didn't know where. My parents drove from Rhode Island, 3.5 hours, sat in my apartment with me. The call came. They were going to go wherever TWA was sending me to work. It could have been Tel Aviv. It could have been Bombay. It could have been Rome. It was Paris. How great is that? So I said, I hung up. I said, we're going to Paris. They got up. I put on my uniform, splurged on a cab with them. And then I went to check in and stuff. They went to the gate. And then here I was at the boarding door when they came on, everybody like really fawned over them. And we were only there at night, right? That was how layovers worked. So we arrived at like 10 in the morning. They're falling asleep. I was so jet lagged, I could stay awake forever. I take them out for like a big breakfast kind of thing. We take a bus tour of the city. We take a boat ride. We go shopping. We go for a big dinner. And they fly back with me the next day. It was so fun.
I'm just sitting here imagining their suitcases. What did they pack?
Oh my gosh, this is so funny. I don't know, but I know coming back, they fell in love with all the different cheeses, right? And so my mother had bought a bunch and she put it in her suitcase, but we know French cheese, which is delicious and lovely, can also be kind of stinky. Uh-huh. And I'm walking down the aisle, doing my job, and I'm like, something really smells bad, and it is my mother's cheese in the overhead. And so I had to say, Mom, I'm going to take the cheese.
She knows what's up. So now we have a couple of questions about your writing process, which I'm also very eager to hear about. First question is, how did you decide how much to share about your personal adventures, decisions, and what you learned about yourself as you were writing this?
I was pretty open. I can't think of anything that I really held back. I did not name celebrities or politicians who misbehaved, because my purpose in this wasn't at all to point fingers at people or get people laughed at or embarrassed. So I left out those details, but I pretty much did everything else. And if I had a celebrity or politician or someone who was fun or, whatever, I did name them. Like that. I had Richard Gere on flights kind of a lot for a while. And, but I wasn't always working first class. And the time I was working first class and he was there, I mean, I just found him pretty, pretty dreamy, and plus movie star, I was like 22. That was pretty cool. And we had hot fudge sundaes. And so I have the cart with all the ice cream and the toppings and all the stuff. And he's dressed in like a suit. He looks like so darling. And I go up and, do you want an ice cream sundae? Yes. And it's like, okay, hot fudge or butterscotch. And he said, whatever, whipped cream, yes. And then I looked at him, I said, nuts. And I was like, oh my gosh, I want to die right now. And it is not that embarrassing, but it was to me. And he cracked up. Like he realized this poor young woman, just had to say that to me. So, I would tell the names and things like that. But otherwise, it was more about me. And I'm pretty open about how I felt about things. So I was happy to share, because to me, it's sort of a coming of age story.
it reads like a coming of age story, and it reads like a coming of age story influence, like out in the open world. That's what was so fun about reading it, that it was, the settings of the book where these, where these different things are happening to you and you're having these realizations and thoughts are really interesting to be in, also as a reader. So can you speak a little bit about your process in writing this? How long did you take to write and edit it?
Oh, wow. The pandemic was terrible in most ways, but I have to say that writing a book about a time I could go anywhere and, at any time, and did go everywhere, to write about that when I couldn't even go to my grocery store was really, I could not have matched this project to a better time to write it if I tried. So I was able to really fly off in my head when I sat down to work every day, even though, we were still like washing our Amazon boxes or whatever outside, outside the door when we were ordering like toothpaste because we couldn't buy it.
Exactly.
I mean, it was like such a strange time to be writing about this freedom and this great time in my life. So, I have a pretty strict writing schedule. I write 2 hours a day, pretty much every day. And I just stuck to that. I probably did more during the pandemic because there were less things pulling at me. I wasn't going places to give talks or teach or whatever. So I probably wrote more. I spent a lot of time on the research, which I had started before the pandemic. So I was also offered the opportunity to kind of weed through it and write those first not very good drafts where I told everybody everything I knew. And then to pull that back and to start really thinking about me and what I had done and what I had felt. Because remember, I got hired in 1978. I flew until 1986. That's a long time ago. I had to do a lot of work to get back to who that person was who did that. And so part of my process was really a lot of self-examination, jogging my memory. I would remember an incident and really have to pause and think, how did I feel when that happened? I remember it happening. But at the age of 26, when a passenger died on my flight, I remember many details about it, but I had to really think about what did I feel? And by giving so much thought to it, I remembered that none of my roommates were home when I got home that night, and I wished they were. As many times as I wished for time alone, that was one night that I wished someone was there that I could, because I just wanted to tell what had happened. So, but I had forgotten that. So a lot of details a lot of the work came from really just introspection.
I was going to ask, I wanted to ask you, how did your process for writing this differ from your process from writing novels? It sounds like, there was more introspection and kind of digging into these different things, but was there, you mentioned research and looking at all of these TWA kind of aid memoirs and the details around the nonfiction that really bring nonfiction to life. I'm very curious, as a nonfiction writer I've tried once to write fiction, not good. So, I'm very curious to hear what you found the differences to be.
I find fiction being so freeing because you don't like the way the story's going, you just have a stranger come to town or you kill someone off and everything changes. The kinds of thinking you do are so different. The way you get out of sticky situations because you invent everything. So I find fiction writing so fun. I'm creating a whole world. And I have to say that from the time I was little, I loved doing that. Like I would do things when I was like 8 years old. I would make up a school. And then I would make up teachers and I'd put the students in, and then I'd give the students, families. And so I've always loved kind of being controlling worlds or creating worlds. And fiction allows me to do that. Nonfiction, it's so much more personal, of course. And you already kind of know the story. So for me, the challenge is, what can I discover? So I'm not telling a boring story. If you know what you know at the start, it's not going to be a very good book. And so you still have to be open to discovery, even though you know so much about what's happened.
It's so interesting. Your book traces your movement into your writing career a little bit. But I see that we also have a question about, did you go on to fly for another airline, which leads me to ask you instead, can you explain a little bit about how you went from working as a flight attendant to this, much lauded career as a novelist?
Yes. So I don't want to be too long-winded, though I could, because it's such to me, it was a very interesting time for aviation as well as for me. So I started the year deregulation passed. And just a quick summary for those who don't know what that actually is. It used to be that the government controlled routes and prices for flying to those routes 100%. And so deregulation deregulated that, and the airlines could price fix on their own and got routes more easily, could fly to new places. So it was a big time for competition. But because it was a big time for competition, a lot of airlines went out of business. A lot of airlines couldn't adapt to the new system. And I was sort of caught in that. So because of deregulation and an oil crisis, I was actually laid off from TWA. And during that time, worked for a charter airline and a startup airline, and then returned to TWA. So I did work for other airlines. I was writing away, wrote a terrible novel. I didn't finish it. It was so bad. And, but I loved writing it. But it was like, if I read a book by Fitzgerald, I wrote this romantic, very languagey, poetic chapter. And then if I read a Raymond Carver short story, I wrote this minimalist, didn't name characters chapter. I made every first novel this mistake, which we must do as novelists, right? And one day when I looked at it, I was like, this is terrible. I picked it up. It was about 300, 400 pages. I picked it up. I was living on Sullivan Street in Greenwich Village. I walked out the front door, put it right in the dumpster. I was like, this isn't even. Oh yeah. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
This is so bad. Like, I was embarrassed by it. I always say, if you're alone in a room and you're embarrassed by something you just wrote, you get rid of it, like, because no one else is seeing it. Right.
Yep.
And yeah. So, and then I went up and I started what became my first novel. And I started as short stories. And it was kind of motivated by the loss of my only brother when he was 30 and I was 25. And me thinking about that 5-year difference and how he'd had a very different high school, college, after college experience, because he was like in the heart of the 60s. So I wanted to write about people who had come through that, and with various triumphs and scars and loss. And so I was writing all these stories. My boyfriend at the time, who I met on a flight, he's called 47F in the book, read some of the stories and told me I should take a writing class. And so I did. I took a couple at NYU. And one of my teachers sent me to the Breadloaf Writers Conference. And there, Nicholas Delbanco, the writer and teacher, read it and said, this is going to be a novel and it should be published. And I came back from Breadloaf with an agent. I mean, it's like a Cinderella story, except I'd been writing forever, never showing anyone until I felt confident doing it. No one saw that novel in the dumpster but me, So before I knew it, I had a book contract. I was still working as a flight attendant. It was pretty dreamy.
In Fly Girl, it's so triumphant because, we've watched you taking these notes whenever you have time, and then kind of lamenting the fact that you didn't have the time or energy because you were working really freaking hard.
Yeah, right.
It was a hard job, as glamorous as, and I think it was a hard job when it was, my impression of it, having interviewed a lot of people, is that it was a very hard job when you were doing it. And then when you weren't, when you were in these wonderful places, you wanted to have the energy to sink into them, because that was the whole reason why you took the job, the whole purpose of doing it.
Yeah, you didn't do it to be on a plane with 300 people. You did it to be out.
And you didn't do it to sit in a hotel room and write. Exactly. And you didn't do it to, you did it. But at the same time, I talked to a couple of former flight attendants and stewardesses who mentioned the exact same things that you mentioned, as far as working in flight, honing your instincts as a writer, the amount of conversation that you can overhear and the way that your ear for dialogue really changes.
Yes, definitely.
And like being present, like we were talking about earlier, at these huge moments of people's lives, your exposure to this level of
absolutely
real human need and interaction is so finely tuned by that.
Yeah, absolutely.
We have someone asking whether you would ever consider writing a novel set in the air.
Oh, Julia, you froze, so I didn't hear the question.
Sorry.
I'm sorry.
The question is whether you would ever consider writing a novel set in the air.
Oh, I don't think so. You never say never. But I feel like when I was writing about things I felt and did and the job, I felt like if it was fiction, it would be almost too coffee tea or me maybe. It would be hard to create characters that didn't seem like sort of cut out characters, because we have these ideas of them. I think I'm happy to tell the story. It took me all these years to even tell my own story. That I'm happy to do imaginative worlds, I think.
I also think this ties into another question is someone is saying that he or she has a good friend who was a captain for a major airline who always referred to flight attendants as glorified waitresses derogatively. And the questioner is asking whether you found this attitude often in the industry. He or she hopes not.
Well, I don't think other flight attendants and the wonderful flight attendants who trained us ever referred to as something like that. I can't speak to what pilots thought. My interaction with them was part of our job was to bring them their crew, their meals, and make sure they had beverages and things like that. TWA hadn't hired pilots in a long time when I started as a flight attendant, so they were much older. Yes. The cockpits were older. We didn't all go out as a crew often. When I worked on a charter airline, that was different. Everybody kind of went out together. But the sexism did exist. And also there were people who seemed like your uncle or, your neighbor or your grandfather or like a nice guy. So like all jobs and all people, it sort of ran, there were all types.
So the reason why I thought of that when you answered your question about whether you would ever make a novel set in the air is that I am of the opinion that these stories of flight attendants and stewardesses in the 60s, I think from, inception on, from the first stewardess in 1926 onward to I think the 80s, even 90s, I think these stories are so much more powerful as nonfiction because the stereotyping is so thick.
Yes.
And it's just so reflexive. So to me, the idea that if you made it fiction, people might say, oh, but flight attendants don't go to law school.
Yeah, it takes away
reality.
Yeah,
plenty do.
Of course.
Or, flight attendants, just like that guy on your plane, flight attendants don't read. Yeah.
Right, exactly. I agree with you.
So I'm sorry to jump in here, but I'm afraid we are out of time. This has been such a great conversation, and I wanted to let it go as long as I possibly could. Because
sorry, my time management is not good with Anne.
That's okay. That's all right.
Julia, I could talk to you forever about this stuff. I always love talking to you.
Well, I think we could listen forever, but unfortunately, or fortunately, we have more events, so I'm going to have to cut it short. But we had so many great questions from the audience, so thank you everyone for pitching in. It makes this whole Zoom session so much more dynamic. And I don't know if you saw in the chat, but the daughter of the author of Coffee, Tea, or Me is in the
You're
session
kidding.
here right now, and she's been chiming in saying that was my dad.
Oh, you're kidding
Lori,
me.
I see you there.
Wow. Oh, that's too bad.
Yeah. So Anne and Julia, thank you so much for such a fabulous conversation. Fly Girl, I believe, is coming out. Did you say, is it
Monday?
Monday, great. So everybody run to your independent bookstore and get Fly Girl. Thank you so much. I see everyone at more sessions today and tomorrow. Have a great
Thank you,
time.
everybody. Thank you, Julia.
Bye.
Thank you, Jen.
Thanks, Jen, for having me.
It was great.